sign these mortgage papers right now. What's the point of keeping this land when your son is about to lose everything? My son dropped the documents on my porch table, expecting me to give up the land my family had protected for generations. I calmly pushed the papers back and said, "I will never hand over what belongs to my family." His expression changed instantly. He picked up his phone and walked away, believing he had finally found a way to force my decision. But he forgot one thing. I knew exactly what those papers were hiding. Thank you so much for joining me on Dad's Revenge Stories. I would love to know where my audience is located today. Drop your city or country in the comments. Please remember, this tale contains fictional elements designed to entertain and educate. Resemblances to actual events or identities are entirely coincidental, but the takeaway is profoundly practical. The coffee was still hot when I heard his truck. I had been sitting on the front porch since 5:30 the way I always do, watching the morning crawl across the pasture in long gold strips. 63 acres of it, every inch paid for in sweat and stubbornness, the way my father taught me and his father taught him. The one thing in this world that had never let me down. I heard the engine before I saw the headlights. Too fast for this road, too aggressive for a Sunday morning. My stomach knew what my eyes hadn't confirmed yet. I set the mug down on the porch rail and waited. Julian came through the gate without slowing. Gravel sprayed against the fence post. He was out of the truck before it fully stopped moving, the way he always moved when money was involved. Like everything around him was falling apart, and he could not afford to slow down. "Dad." He took the porch steps 2 at a time and dropped a thick envelope on the small table beside my chair. Papers spilled halfway out. I could see the bank letterhead without picking them up. "I need you to sign those today." I looked at my son. He was 40 years old, and the years hadn't been gentle. There were hollows under his eyes that hadn't been there at 30, and his jaw carried the tight, grinding tension of a man who had been lying to himself for a very long time. I had seen that look before, not on Julian, but on men I had interviewed across a table in small rooms with no windows. Men who had run out of honest options and were now standing at the edge of something they couldn't come back from. "Sit down," I said. "I don't have time to sit down, Dad. I need you to sign. Then you can stand while I talk." I picked up my coffee and took a slow sip. "This is the third time in 4 years you've come to me with papers. First time I gave you $40,000 from the sale of the North Field. Second time I co-signed a business loan that cost me 18 months of interest payments when you defaulted. Both times I told you this is the last time. Both times I meant it." I set the mug down. "So whatever is in that envelope, my answer is already decided." Julian's jaw tightened so hard I heard his teeth click together. "This is different." "It never is." "Dad." He lowered his voice, and something in it shifted, the anger dropping away just enough to let the fear show through underneath. Real fear. The kind that lives in the chest and doesn't leave when you sleep. "These people are not a bank. They are not a lender I can negotiate with. If I don't come back with this sign today, I don't know what they will do to me. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I understood exactly what he was telling me. I had spent 22 years as a criminal investigator before my knees gave out and forced me into retirement, and I knew what it meant when a man said "these people" instead of naming them. It meant the situation was far more serious than a normal financial problem. "Then go to the police," I said. "The police." He laughed, and it was the ugliest sound I had heard in a long time. "Right. Great idea, Dad. If you're in danger, Julian, sign the papers." He slapped his hand flat on the envelope. "Just sign them and this goes away. They get what they want, I get clear, and we both move on." I looked at the papers again. The documents were a deed of trust mortgage agreement, a legal instrument that would allow the holder to foreclose on and seize the property if payments were missed, without going through the lengthy court process that a standard mortgage required. In plain terms, whoever held that note could take my land on a default notice with 60 days. No judge, no jury, no appeal that a man of my means could afford to fight. This isn't a loan, I said. This is a transfer with a countdown attached. It's a mortgage. It's a deed of trust structured for a non-institutional lender. I know what this is, Julian. I have seen it before. The men who drafted this paper make their money by collecting properties, not payments. I pushed the envelope back across the table toward him. I am not signing this. The fear in his face hardened back into something colder. He straightened up and took a breath the way a man does when he has made a decision he knows he will regret. "You're really going to do this?" he said. "You're going to sit there on your porch and let them come after me because you won't put your name on a piece of paper?" "I'm going to sit here on my porch and not hand 63 acres of family land to a money laundering operation," I said. "Because that is what is behind this paper, Julian. I don't know how deeply you're in with them, but I know what this document is, and I know who drafts documents like this." He stared at me for a long moment. His hands were shaking, not from anger, I realized, from genuine terror. Whatever he had gotten himself into, it had its teeth in him deep. "I'm your son," he said. The words came out quieter than anything else he had said, and they landed somewhere painful because of it. "You are," I said. "And I have pulled you back from the edge twice already because of it. But this edge is different. If I sign this paper, I am not saving you. I am financing whatever comes next." Julian reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His thumb moved across the screen with the deliberate calm of a man performing an action he had rehearsed. He held it up so I could see he was dialing. His eyes met mine over the phone, flat and cold, in a way I had never seen on my son's face before. "It's your choice, old man," he said. He put the phone to his ear and turned away, walking back down the porch steps toward his truck. I watched him. Listened to the quiet, one-sided conversation. Yes, the old man said no, go ahead, and felt something settle in my chest that was not peace exactly, but was the closest thing to it. The certainty of a man who had already decided what he would and would not do. Inside the house, I heard Tommy's footsteps on the floorboards. The boy had an instinct for trouble, even half asleep. 17 years old and sharper than most people, twice his age. "Grandpa." His voice came through the screen door. Is everything okay?" Julian ended the call and got back in his truck without looking at me again. "Go back inside, Tommy," I said. The truck reversed hard, spinning gravel, and disappeared down the road in a cloud of pale dust. I sat back down in my chair and picked up my coffee. It had gone cold. Less than 3 minutes later, I heard the first siren wail up from the direction of the county road. Then a second one closer, moving fast. I did not reach for the phone. I did not go inside. I set down the cold coffee, looked out at the 63 acres my family had held for 3 generations, and I waited to see what my son had set in motion. They came for me on Ridgeline Road, about 2 miles past the grain elevator where the pines close in on both sides, and there is nothing between you and the horizon but cracked asphalt and red clay. I had left the farm an hour after Julian drove away. My blood pressure medication was running low, 3 pills left in the bottle, and the pharmacy in Callaway closed at 4 on Sundays. It was the kind of errand that had no drama in it, the kind of thing a man in his 60s does without thinking twice. I was not thinking twice. I was thinking about the look on my son's face when he turned away and made that call, and whether I had handled it the right way, and whether there was a right way to handle it at all. The first cruiser came up fast behind me, lights strobing red and blue in my rearview mirror. I checked my speedometer, 41 miles per hour in a 45 zone. I had done nothing wrong. I pulled to the right out of habit and slowed, expecting the car to pass. Instead, it stayed on my bumper. Then the second cruiser came from a dirt access road ahead of me and swung sideways across both lanes, blocking the road completely. I stopped the truck. The two deputies who climbed out were not men I recognized from my years working with the county sheriff's office. Deputy Cray. I read the nameplate when he got close enough, was thick through the shoulders with the kind of flat, expressionless face that belongs to men who have learned to keep their conscience separate from their job. Deputy Sellers stayed near the blocking cruiser with his hand resting on his belt, watching the road in both directions, like he was expecting someone else to arrive. Cray knocked on my window with one knuckle. I rolled it down. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." "On what GS applies?" I asked. I kept my hands visible on the steering wheel the way I had been trained 30 years ago, the way I had advised 100 witnesses to do. "Your vehicle matches the description of a truck involved in a hit-and-run accident on Route 9 this morning. Step out, please." It was a lie constructed with just enough specificity to sound official. Route 9. This morning. I drove Route 9 twice a week and had not left the farm before 6 a.m. But I also knew that arguing the point on a deserted road with two armed men who had already decided how this was going to go was not a strategy. I opened the door and stepped out slowly, keeping my hands at shoulder height. Cray moved fast. He quickly moved me away from the vehicle and placed me under temporary restraint while I tried to understand what was happening. The cruiser had been running hard. The hood was scorching, radiating heat through my shirt and against my cheek like an open oven door. I turned my face to the side and pressed my jaw against the metal and focused on breathing evenly. "You are hurting me," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Stay still," Cray said. Sellers had moved to the passenger side of my truck and was looking through the window at the interior. Not searching, looking, checking for something specific. The whole stop had the feel of a performance with a predetermined ending, and both men knew their lines. Then Cray's radio crackled. He unclipped it and did something I did not expect. He turned on the speaker, and Julian's voice suddenly filled the air. "Dad." Julian's voice came through the speaker with a clarity that turned my stomach. He was not calling from far away. He was close. "You still want to be stubborn about this?" I said nothing. The hood of the cruiser burned against my cheekbone. "These gentlemen are going to stay right there with you until I get what I need," Julian continued. His voice had the rehearsed calm of someone reading from a script he had written in advance. "You're 70 years old, Dad. A man your age standing out here alone, this situation can become difficult quickly. All you have to do is say yes, and I'll tell them to let you go. Just say yes." The fury that moved through me then was not hot. It was cold and precise, the way anger gets when it has been filtered through enough years to know exactly what it is. This was my son. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle on the same road where he had just arranged to have me pinned to a police cruiser hood. This was the child whose college tuition I had paid, and whose wedding I had stood beside him at, and whose grief I had shared when his mother died. I said, keeping my voice low and deliberate. "Listen to me very carefully. I know what you're into. I know who these people are, and what this paper is really for. You think signing it saves you, but it doesn't. It just moves the problem forward 6 months and makes me part of it when it lands. Dad, I am not signing. My voice did not shake. My hands cuffed behind me and burning against the back of the cruiser did not shake either. Not today, not tomorrow, not with my face on a hot hood or my arm behind my back or against my head. You need to hear that and believe it, because I will not say it again. There was a long pause on the radio. I heard Julian exhale. Your choice, he said. And then the line went dead. Cray straightened up behind me. I heard the creak of leather as he reached for something on his belt, and I closed my eyes. 70 years old, retired. 2 bad knees and a blood pressure prescription running low 3 pills. I had stood in worse places than this, though not recently and not alone. I braced myself against the hood and waited. Then the sound came from the south end of Ridgeline Road. It started low and built fast, the layered wail of multiple sirens moving at speed, the kind of sound that does not belong to one car or two. I opened my eyes. At the far end of the road past the blocking cruiser, a pair of headlights crested the hill, then another pair. Then 2 more moving in tight formation, closing the distance fast. Sellers saw them first. His hand came off his belt. Cray, he said. His voice had lost every trace of authority it had carried 60 seconds earlier. Cray, that's... I see it, Cray said. The 4 black SUVs hit their emergency lights simultaneously, and Ridgeline Road turned red and blue from tree line to tree line. They came in hard and stopped in a staggered formation that boxed both cruisers in place. Before the dust finished rising, the doors were already opening. The agent who took the handcuffs off was a woman about 50, with close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of calm that is not indifference but discipline, the calm of someone who has seen worse than this and learned not to let it show on her face. She checked my wrists without being asked, turning them over in her hands to examine the marks the cuffs had left. The right wrist showed signs of discomfort from the restraint, and she carefully checked to make sure I was okay. She pressed 2 fingers against it, with more gentleness than I expected from a federal agent on a roadside. I'm Special Agent Helen Marsh, she said. Are you injured anywhere else, Mr. Walter? My cheek caught some heat from the hood, I said. Nothing serious. We'll have the paramedic look at it. She turned toward the cruisers where 3 other agents had Deputy Cray and Deputy Sellers separated and against their respective vehicles. Both men had been disarmed. Cray was talking fast, the way guilty men do when they are trying to establish a version of events before anyone else can. Sellers had gone completely quiet, which told me he was the smarter of the 2, and had already decided that anything he said would be used against him. Marsh walked me toward one of the black SUVs and opened the rear door. Please sit. Out of the sun. I sat. The air conditioning hit me like cold water, and I realized how hot I actually was. The back of my shirt was soaked through, and the burn on my cheekbone had started to throb with my pulse. I leaned against the seat and looked out through the windshield at the pine trees lining both sides of Ridgeline Road, and I thought about how ordinary this stretch of road had looked 90 minutes ago when I drove down it the first time. Marsh climbed into the front passenger seat and turned to face me. Mr. Walter, before I ask you anything, I want you to know something. We were not responding to a call about you. We were already in the area. She paused, letting that settle. We have been monitoring Vance Capital Group for 8 months. Deputies Cray and Sellers are known associates. When our surveillance unit picked up radio communication consistent with an unauthorized detention, we moved. 8 months, I said. 8 months. She held my gaze steadily. We know about the mortgage documents. We know about Julian's debt structure with the organization. and we know this was not a spontaneous decision on your son's part today." I looked at her. "How much do you know about my son?" Before she could answer, the rear door on the driver's side opened and Tommy dropped into the seat beside me. He was still in the clothes he had been wearing when I left the farm. Old jeans and a gray t-shirt with a tear at the collar, and his face was flushed and damp from running. He threw both arms around my neck and held on with the grip of someone who had genuinely believed for some portion of the last 2 hours that he might not see me again. "I'm okay," I said into his hair. "Tommy, I'm okay." He pulled back and looked at my cheek, and his eyes went red at the corners. "It's a scrape. I've had worse shaving." I put my hand on the back of his neck the way I used to when he was small. "How did you get here?" "Some May brought me." He wiped his face with the back of his hand and straightened up, pulling himself together with the particular pride of a teenage boy who does not want to be seen crying by a federal agent. "I called her right after you left. After I heard what Julian said on the phone." I looked at him. "You heard the call?" I wasn't trying to listen. His jaw tightened. But the kitchen window was open, and he was on the porch, and I heard him say, "Go ahead." I knew what that meant. He looked down at his hands in his lap. "I knew something was going to happen to you on the road. So I called May and told her what I heard, and she called the FBI tip line, and I gave them your license plate and told them which direction you went." I sat with that for a moment. 17 years old. His parents both gone before he was 12, his mother, my daughter-in-law, from cancer, and his father from the kind of slow, bad choices that amount to the same thing eventually. He had been living on the farm with me for 4 years, and in all that time I had never once heard him complain about it. "You did exactly right," I said. He's your son," Tommy said. The words came out with a complicated weight that belonged to someone much older. And he still did that. I did not have an answer for that. Some truths do not have answers. They just sit there and ask you to carry them. From the front seat, Marsh said carefully, "Mr. Walter, I want to be straightforward with you. Your son fled the area before our units could locate him. We have his vehicle description, and we've notified county and state, but as of right now, Julian is not in custody." Outside, an older woman in a yellow cardigan was climbing out of a dusty Honda Civic parked behind the last FBI vehicle. May Briggs. She had lived on the property adjacent to mine for 26 years, and she walked toward the SUV with the upright, purposeful stride of a woman who has decided that being 71 years old is not a reason to slow down. She knocked on my window. I rolled it down. "Walter Hayes," she said, looking at my cheek. "I want you to know that I took photographs of both those police cars and their license plates before anyone arrived, and I have already emailed them to my nephew, who is an attorney in Birmingham." "May," I said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank Tommy. I was asleep." She looked past me at my grandson with an expression that mixed pride and heartbreak in the particular way that older women look at children who have had to grow up faster than they should. "That boy called me at 2:43 in the afternoon and told me exactly what to do and exactly who to call. He had the FBI tip line number already written on a piece of paper." I turned and looked at Tommy. He shrugged one shoulder. "I looked it up last night," he said. "When Julian called and said he was coming over in the morning, I had a feeling." I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder and could not find words sufficient to the moment, so I did not try to find them. Marcia's phone buzzed in the front seat. She looked at the screen and her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. She turned to face me. "Mr. Walter." She held the phone out so I could see the screen. A video was playing. A dark room. Even with the poor lighting and the angle, I knew the shape of those shoulders. I had stood next to them for 22 years. "That's Frank," I said. My voice came out rough. "That is Frank Briggs." Marsh nodded. "We believe he is being held at a location controlled by Vance's organization. The message attached to this video contains instructions." She lowered the phone. "Mr. Walter, they want you to come alone." I watched the video 3 times. The first time I was looking for injuries. The second time I was looking for details in the background. The walls, the floor, the quality of the light. The way I used to study crime scene photographs back when that was my job. The third time I just watched Frank. The way his shoulders sat. The way his head hung forward not from unconsciousness, but from the particular exhaustion of a man who had been afraid for a long time and had finally run out of the energy to hide it. Frank Briggs had been the county sheriff for 14 years before he retired. Before that, he and I had worked the same investigative unit for 2 decades. 2 desks facing each other in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and old paperwork, where we had spent more waking hours together than either of us had spent with our wives. He was 68 years old. He had a replaced left hip and a heart that his cardiologist had been watching cautiously for 3 years, and he had absolutely no business being in a metal chair in a dark room with his wrists bound. How long has he been there?" I asked. Marsh was watching me carefully from the front seat. "Based on the metadata embedded in the video file, we believe the recording was made approximately 14 hours ago, which puts the initial detention at somewhere around 2 o'clock this morning. They took him in the middle of the night." "Yes." I handed the phone back to her. My hand was steady. I made sure of that. "The message. What exactly does it say?" Marsh read from her screen. "Come to the east boundary of your property tonight. Come alone. Come without your phone. When we confirm you are alone, Frank Briggs will be allowed to leave. If you involve law enforcement." She lowered the phone. "Mr. Walter, I want to be direct with you. We do not believe they intend to release Frank regardless of your compliance. This message is designed to isolate you from protection, not to facilitate an exchange." "I know what it's designed to do," I said. "I wrote similar messages myself 30 years ago when I was building cases against people who used human leverage. The language is standard." I looked out the window at the tree line. The sun was lower now, cutting through the pines at a long angle, turning the dust on Ridgeline Road the color of old copper. "What I need to know is whether you can find him before tonight." "We are working on it. The video metadata gives us a partial GPS signature, but it has been deliberately obscured. Our technical unit is running it now." Marsh paused. "I have to ask you directly, are you considering complying with their instructions?" Before I could answer, Tommy spoke from beside me. He had been sitting with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. Since Marsh read the message aloud, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of someone working very hard not to say the thing they actually wanted to say. "Tell her no, Grandpa." I looked at him. "Tell her no," he said again, quieter this time, the anger giving way to something that hurt more. "Frank wouldn't want you to go alone. You know that." The boy was right. Frank would have said the same thing to me in the same situation, with the same conviction, and he would have been right too. That was the problem with Frank. He was almost always right, and being right had never once stopped either of us from doing the thing we had already decided to do. "I'm not going to walk into an open field alone at night," I told Marsh. "That is not what I'm considering." I watched something relax slightly in her posture. "What I am considering is why they chose Frank specifically. There are other people in my life they could have used. My neighbor, my grandson." I nodded toward Tommy. "Frank is not family. He is my closest friend, but choosing him over Tommy or May requires specific knowledge of my relationships. The kind of knowledge you build by watching someone for a significant period of time. Marsh nodded slowly. That is consistent with what we know about Vance's operational approach. Targeted surveillance preceding leverage. They would have assessed your relationships and selected the most effective pressure point. She hesitated. There is something else. During our financial investigation, we identified a series of irregular wire transfers connected to Julian's debt account. The transfers originated from a personal checking account belonging to a Franklin D. Briggs. She watched my face. The amounts correlate with Julian's payment history over approximately 3 years. The SUV was very quiet. Outside, I could hear the agents moving around the scene, the low crackle of radios, May's voice somewhere behind the vehicle still talking to someone with the firm, carrying tone of a woman accustomed to being heard. Frank was paying Julian's debts, I said. In amounts consistent with that interpretation, yes. Without telling me. The transfers carry no notes or references, Marsh said carefully. We can't confirm his intent from the financial record alone, but the timing and the amounts. He was covering for my son, I said. The words came out flat, and even because that was the only way I knew how to say things that cost me something. For 3 years, Frank was quietly spending his own retirement savings to keep Julian above water, and he never said a word to me about it. Tommy was watching me with the careful attention of someone who understood that they were witnessing something that mattered. I looked at my hands in my lap. The wrist marks from the cuffs had darkened to a dull red, and I thought about Frank sitting across from me at that coffee-stained desk for 20 years, and all the things 2 people can know about each other and still manage to keep hidden. He didn't tell me. I said more to myself than to either of them because he knew I would have stopped him. Mr. Walter, Marsh's voice was gentle but direct. I need you to make me a promise. Whatever you are thinking about doing tonight, do not do it alone. Promise me that. I looked at her. She had good eyes, the kind that had seen enough to earn the right to ask that question. I promise, I said. Tommy exhaled beside me. And then from under the back seat of the SUV where he had set it when he climbed in, his phone buzzed against the floor mat. He picked it up, looked at the screen, and held it out to me without a word. In his palm was a small black object, no larger than a matchbox. He had set it beside the phone so I could see both at once. The text on his screen read, "Found this taped under the rear axle of your truck, Grandpa. Took a picture before I pulled it off. Sending to you now." But Tommy was already here, which meant he had sent the message before he got in the car. He had found it at the farm, before we left. I picked up the small black device and turned it over in my fingers. A GPS tracker, a commercial-grade unit, the kind available online for under $100, with a magnetic mount and a battery life of several weeks. I had seen them in evidence bags more times than I could count. Someone had placed it on my truck recently enough that the battery indicator light on its side still glowed a solid green. I set the tracker on the seat between us and looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was a small thing to carry so much weight. Rectangular matte black, about the size of a book of matches, the kind of device you could order online on a Tuesday and have on your doorstep by Thursday. I had processed evidence bags containing identical units at least a dozen times over my career. I knew exactly what they cost, exactly how they worked, and exactly what it meant when one turned up on a vehicle belonging to someone who had not consented to being followed. Depending on the state and circumstances, secretly placing a tracking device on another person's vehicle without their knowledge can violate privacy and surveillance laws. The legality depends on who owns the vehicle, why it was placed, and how the information was used. It does not matter whether the vehicle belongs to a family member. It does not matter whether the person doing it believes they have a reason. The law is specific on this point, and the law does not make exceptions for sons who want to know where their fathers are going. When did you find it? I asked Tommy. This morning, he said, after Julian left. I went out to check if his truck had leaked oil on the driveway. He always leaks oil, and I saw it when I was looking under the rear axle. It was magnetic, stuck to the frame just behind the differential. And you didn't tell me before we left. He looked at me steadily. You would have stayed home. I could not argue with that. I probably would have. I looked back at the device and thought about the last time Julian had visited the farm. 3 weeks ago, a Sunday afternoon. He had said he was passing through on his way to a job site. He stayed for dinner, which surprised me, because Julian rarely stayed for anything that did not benefit him directly. He had been pleasant enough, quieter than usual, almost careful, and he had asked to borrow a socket wrench from the garage because he said something was rattling under his dashboard. I had handed him the wrench and gone back inside to finish the dishes. He had been in the garage for 20 minutes. He came in October, I said. 3 weeks ago. He asked to borrow a tool. Tommy nodded. I know. I was in the barn. I saw him go under your truck, but I thought he was checking something. I didn't know what he was doing. You couldn't have known. I picked the tracker up again and turned it over. The magnetic mount on the back was coated in red clay dust. It had been under there long enough to collect road grime, which put the installation date consistent with October. 3 weeks of data. 3 weeks of my routes, my schedules, my habits. Every pharmacy run, every trip to the feed store, every Wednesday morning when I drove May to her physical therapy appointment in Callaway, because her daughter lived 3 states away, and I had a truck and nothing more pressing to do with my time. Marsh reached over the seat and held out an evidence bag. I dropped the tracker into it. We'll pull the location history from the device's internal memory, she said. It will tell us every coordinate it recorded and when. If Julian shared access to the tracking account with anyone else in the organization, we may be able to identify those individuals through the login records. He shared it with whoever directed him, I said. Julian doesn't have the technical capability to set up something like this on his own. Someone told him what to buy, told him where to put it, and told him how to access the data. I looked at her. Which means Vance's people have known my movements for 3 weeks. They knew I drove to the pharmacy on Sunday afternoons. They knew which road I took. They had Cray and Sellers positioned before Julian even walked through my door this morning. Marsh absorbed that without visible reaction, which meant she had already reached the same conclusion and was simply confirming it. That is consistent with what we know about how the organization operates. The approach to your son would have come first, establishing the debt, increasing the pressure, identifying your property as the target asset. Conventional means, I said, requests, appeals, arguments. He tried all of those, I said. Over 4 years, the SUV was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the agents had finished processing the scene on Ridgeline Road. Both cruisers had been moved to the shoulder and their occupants transported separately for questioning. The road was empty now except for the FBI vehicles and May's dusty Honda, and the long afternoon light was turning everything amber and flat. Tommy was looking at his hands again. He did that when he was working through something, folded them in his lap, and stared at them the way some people stare at ceilings. I had noticed it when he first came to live with me 4 years ago. This boy who had lost both his parents before he was 13 and had arrived at my farm with one duffel bag and the careful stillness of a child who had learned that expressing too much got you nowhere. He used his visit to install surveillance on you, Tommy said. He was not asking. He was stating it plainly, turning it over in the light to look at all its angles. He sat at your kitchen table and ate your food, and then went out and put a tracker on your truck. Yes. While you were doing the dishes. Yes. Tommy looked up from his hands. His eyes were dry, but the emotion behind them was not. I want to ask you something, Grandpa, and I need you to answer me honestly. All right. Are you still going to try to help him? I looked at my grandson, this boy, who had more reason than most to understand what it meant to be failed by someone who was supposed to protect you, who had nonetheless shown up at my farm 4 years ago and built a life out of early mornings and hard work and the quiet loyalty of someone who had decided, without being asked, to be trustworthy. I thought about what Julian had done this morning, and what he had arranged on Ridgeline Road, and what he had installed under my truck 3 weeks ago while I stood at my kitchen sink. Why, he is my son, I said. That doesn't change what he did. It doesn't excuse it. But it doesn't change what it is either. Tommy held my gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, once a slow, reluctant acknowledgement that he understood even if he did not agree. Marcia's phone rang. She answered it, listened for 30 seconds, and turned to face us with an expression that had sharpened into something urgent. Mr. Walter, she said. Our field office just received a copy of an environmental complaint filed with the county 6 days ago. It alleges chemical runoff along the eastern boundary of your property. She paused. The county approved an inspection order this afternoon. Equipment and environmental officers are scheduled to arrive at your farm tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. I looked at her. They are going to dig up your eastern fence line, she said. We drove back to the farm in 2 FBI vehicles, Marsh and Tommy with me in the lead SUV, 2 agents following behind. Nobody talked much on the ride. The road back felt shorter than it usually did, the way roads always feel shorter when you are moving toward something you do not want to face. The kitchen light was on when we pulled in. May had driven ahead and let herself in with the spare key she had kept for 12 years. And by the time we came through the back door, she had a pot of coffee going and a plate of cornbread on the table that she must have brought from her own house, because I had not bought cornbread mix in 2 months. That was May. She processed difficulty by feeding people, and I had never once complained about it. Marsh spread a map across the kitchen table, a county surveyor's plat of my property, the kind of official document that shows every boundary line, every easement, every recorded feature of the land going back to the original deed. She placed her finger on the eastern boundary line, a straight edge running 400 yards along the back of the property where my land met the old Greer timber lease. 6 days ago, she said, a complaint was filed with the county environmental office alleging chemical runoff originating from this boundary area. The complaint cited specific coordinates. She tapped the map. Those coordinates correspond to a point approximately 80 feet inside your eastern fence line. I leaned over the map and looked at the spot she was indicating. I knew that ground. I had walked that fence line every spring for 30 years, checking posts and wire after the winter heave. The soil there was sandy and loose, good drainage, which was why my father had planted the orchard on the western side and left the eastern strip as pasture. There was nothing at those coordinates that would generate chemical runoff. There had never been a fuel tank, a chemical shed, or any stored material of any kind within 200 yards of that fence line. The complaint is fabricated, I said. Almost certainly, Marsh agreed. But the county processed it through standard procedure, which means the inspection is legally authorized. When the equipment arrives at 8 tomorrow morning, the operators will have lawful authority to excavate along that boundary. She paused. Which is exactly what someone wants them to do. Because there is something buried there, I said. Marsh looked at me steadily. 3 months ago, during our financial investigation of Vance Capital Group, we identified a storage asset that could not be accounted for in their known physical locations. A data repository, specifically an encrypted hard drive contained in a fireproof steel security box. The box contains transaction records, account structures, shell company documentation, and communication logs covering approximately 11 years of the organization's operations. She folded her hands on the map. If that record exists and can be recovered intact, it is the single most comprehensive piece of evidence we have encountered in 8 months of investigation. It would allow us to prosecute not just Vance, but every individual connected to the organization at every level. Tommy had been standing by the counter with his coffee mug, and he set it down carefully. "And it's buried on our property." "We believe so. Based on the coordinates in the environmental complaint, which were almost certainly provided by someone with knowledge of the box's location, yes." I straightened up from the map. The kitchen felt smaller than usual. Outside the window, the sky had gone fully dark, and the pasture beyond the porch was a black shape against a slightly less black sky. Somewhere out past the eastern fence line, 80 feet inside my boundary, there was a steel box full of 11 years of crimes sitting in the sandy soil under my family's land. "How did it get there?" I asked. "So we don't know with certainty," Marsh said. "The most likely explanation is that it was placed there by someone who needed a location that was off the organization's known property, somewhere that would not be searched, somewhere stable and dry." She paused. "Your property borders the old Greer timber lease which Vance Capital acquired 18 months ago through a shell company. The eastern fence line sits between your land and theirs. Whoever buried the box may have chosen that location specifically because it sits on the boundary accessible from both sides." I looked at the map again. 18 months ago. Vance had been positioned next door to me for 18 months, and I had not known it because the sale had gone through 4 layers of corporate paperwork designed to obscure the actual buyer. That was not an accident. That was planning. "They need the box before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," I said. "Yes. Once the county equipment arrives, the excavation will be documented by environmental officers and potentially by news media. Whatever is in that soil becomes part of a public record. Vance cannot allow that." Marsh looked at me directly. "The message they sent about Frank, the instruction to come to the eastern boundary tonight, that was not about obtaining your signature on a mortgage document. They do not need your signature anymore. They need access to that boundary after dark, and they needed you away from FBI protection to get it. They were going to use me to get to the box," I said. "And Julian," Marsh said quietly. We believe Julian was directed to that location as well. Not to assist with the recovery. To be present when it happened." She did not say the rest of it aloud, but she did not need to. I had spent 22 years building cases against men like Vance. I knew what it meant when an organization needed a specific person present at a specific location with no witnesses and no protection. Julian was not being brought there to help. He was being brought there to take the blame for everything: the buried box, the records, the 11 years of crimes, and to make sure he could not tell anyone what he had seen. Tommy moved to stand beside me at the table. He looked at the map at the spot Marsh had marked, and then up at me. "That's where the old apple trees used to be," he said. "Before the blight took them. You told me your mother planted them." "She did," I said. 1961. He reached into his back pocket and laid a folded piece of paper on the table beside the map. On it, in his careful handwriting, was a set of GPS coordinates with a hand-drawn sketch of the fence line and a small X marking a spot 80 feet inside the eastern boundary. "I followed Julian this afternoon," Tommy said. "Before I called May, I saw where he went to look at the ground." He tapped the X on his sketch. "He stood right there for about 2 minutes. Then he made a phone call. I looked at my grandson. 17 years old, standing in my kitchen at 9 o'clock at night with hand-drawn intelligence that had just told us exactly where to focus. Marsh picked up the sketch and looked at it carefully. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the tops of the pine trees along the south fence. The first drops of rain hit the kitchen window, slow at first, then faster. The storm was coming. The photograph had been sitting on my dresser for 11 years. It was taken at Frank's retirement party, the two of us standing outside the county sheriff's office in our good jackets, squinting into the August sun, like a pair of men who had just been told to smile and were doing their best. Frank had his arm around my shoulders, and he was grinning the way he only grinned when something had genuinely caught him off guard and pleased him, which was not often. I was laughing at something he had said right before the camera clicked. I could not remember what it was anymore. I had come into the bedroom to get my blood pressure medication. The errand that had started all of this, the pharmacy run, I had never completed, and I stopped in front of the dresser and looked at that photograph for longer than I intended to. Marsh appeared in the doorway behind me. She had given me 5 minutes, which told me she understood that some things need a small amount of space before they can be discussed. Mr. Walter, I want to share some additional information from our financial investigation. Whenever you're ready. I'm ready, I said without turning around. She came in and stood beside the dresser and looked at the photograph too briefly. The wire transfer records I mentioned earlier, we pulled Frank's full banking history as part of the investigation into Julian's debt structure. What we found was more extensive than I indicated in the car. She set a printed summary on the dresser beside the photograph. Over a period of approximately 3 years and 2 months, Frank made 47 separate transfers to accounts connected to Julian's debt obligations with Vance Capital. The total amount transferred was $214,000. The number sat in the room like something with physical weight. That is nearly his entire retirement account, I said. Yes. Based on the pension records we pulled, Frank's total retirement savings at the time the transfers began was approximately $230,000. Marsh paused. He kept $19,000 in reserve. Every other dollar went toward Julian's debts. I put my hand flat on the dresser and leaned on it. Outside the bedroom window, the rain had intensified. It came down in heavy, wind-driven sheets that rattled the glass and turned the porch light into a blurred orange smear. The storm that had been building all evening had arrived, and it had not arrived gently. He never told me, I said. Not once. Not a word. The transfers carry no memo lines, Marsh said. No notes, no references, no indication of purpose. He structured them to look like routine withdrawals to different accounts. If we had not been specifically investigating Julian's debt history, we likely would not have found the connection. I turned around and looked at her. He structured them to be invisible because he knew that if I found out, I would have made him stop. And he did not want to stop. I heard the roughness in my own voice and did not try to smooth it out. Because he knew that if Julian's debts collapsed while I was still alive, it would come back to the farm. To me. He was trying to hold the wall up long enough that it would not fall on me. Marsh did not say anything to that. She was smart enough to know when a statement did not need a response. I picked up the photograph and looked at Frank's grin, that full, unguarded, genuinely pleased grin that I had seen maybe a dozen times in 22 years. He was not a demonstrative man. He expressed things sideways the way men of our generation often did, through actions that could be explained as something else if the recipient was not paying close enough attention. $214,000, structured to be invisible over 3 years and 2 months. I had not been paying close enough attention. When did the transfers stop? I asked. 8 months ago, Marsh said. approximately when Julian's debt level exceeded what the payments could offset. The account Frank was drawing from was effectively exhausted. At that point, Julian's situation with Vance became critical, and the organization began its current pressure campaign. She paused. We believe Frank's inability to continue the payments is what triggered everything that followed. So that was the shape of it. Frank had held the dam for 3 years with his own money, and when the money ran out, the dam broke and the flood came downhill and hit everything I owned and everyone I was responsible for. He had not told me, because telling me would have meant admitting that he had known how bad Julian's situation was and had chosen to handle it himself rather than bring it to me. He had made that choice out of loyalty and out of love, and out of the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent his whole career solving other people's problems and found it nearly impossible to acknowledge that some problems were too large to solve alone. Tommy appeared in the bedroom doorway. He had changed into a dry shirt, and his hair was damp from the rain, which meant he had been out to the barn. He always checked the animals when a storm came in, without being asked the way he did most necessary things. "The rain is getting bad," he said. "Lightning is moving in from the southwest." He looked at the photograph in my hand, then at my face, and understood enough from both to shift his approach. "You okay, Grandpa?" "I'm working on it," I said honestly. He nodded. That was enough for him. He came into the room and stood beside me and looked at the photograph, and I watched him take in Frank's grin and the way we were standing, and I saw him understand, without being told, that whatever had happened between Frank and the money and Julian and all of it, the man in that photograph had done what he did because he loved someone. "He sounds like you," Tommy said quietly. Before I could answer, the bedroom window lit white. The thunderclap that followed shook the glass in its frame and set the barn dogs barking out back. In the sharp silence after the thunder, I heard Marcia's radio crackle from the kitchen, a voice urgent, too distorted by static to make out the words. Then Tommy's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the screen, and every trace of color left his face. He turned the screen toward me. A text from an unknown number. 4 words and a set of coordinates. Julian just crossed the fence. I handed Tommy back his phone and walked to the living room wall. My father's old hunting equipment had hung there since 1987 on 2 iron hooks he had driven into the studs himself with a ball-peen hammer. Walnut stock worn smooth at the grip from decades of hands. My father had carried it for 30 years before me, and I had carried it for 30 years after him, and it had never once been used against anything that mattered. It had been used at groundhogs and at the occasional copperhead, and once memorably near a hornet's nest that had gotten too close to the barn, but never at anything that required me to make the kind of decision I was making right now. I lifted it off the hooks. "Grandpa." Tommy's voice came from the bedroom doorway. I checked it over clean the way I maintained it and took 2 supplies from the box on the shelf below the hooks, the same load my father kept. The problem with a perimeter on the north access road is that it approaches from the wrong angle. If Julian is already past the eastern fence with 2 armed men beside him, a team coming in from the north has to cover 400 yards of open pasture in the dark and in the rain before they reach him. In that time, a lot can happen. Tommy came into the living room and stood in front of me. He was blocking my path to the back door, not aggressively, but deliberately planting himself the way he had seen me plant myself. I realized in front of things that needed to be stopped. "You promised Marsh you wouldn't go alone," he said. "I promised her I would not walk into an open field alone at night," I said. "I am not walking into the field. I am crossing my own back pasture to reach the eastern fence line on my own property, which I have the legal right to do at any hour of the day or night. That is the same thing." "It is not the same thing, Grandpa." His voice cracked on the second syllable, and he stopped and pulled it back together with visible effort. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but it cost him something. I know why you're going. I know it's not about the box or the records or any of that. He swallowed. I just need you to tell me that's what this is. Say it out loud. I looked at my grandson. The living room light caught his face at an angle that made him look older than 17 and younger at the same time, the way people sometimes look when they are carrying more than they should have to. They brought Julian there to take the blame for everything and leave him with no way to defend himself, I said. The FBI team is real and they are coming, but they are coming from the wrong direction and they do not know exactly where Julian is standing right now. I do. I held up Tommy's sketch, the hand-drawn map with the X at the base of the old apple tree line. 22 years of investigative work tells me that if I am at that location before the FBI reaches it from the north, I can change the geometry of what happens. I can make it harder for them to do what they came to do. I paused. And I am his father. That is also part of it. You were right to say so. Then at my face. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were bright, and he was doing everything in his power not to fall apart. And he was succeeding, and I was proud of him in a way that I did not have adequate words for at that moment. 20 minutes, he said. I'll give you 20 minutes, and then I'm telling Marsh exactly which direction you went, and exactly what path you take to the eastern fence. He pulled his phone out and showed me the screen. He had already pulled up the compass app, already oriented himself. I know the path. I've walked it with you 100 times. 20 minutes? I agreed. And you come back. His voice was very quiet. That's not a request. I put my free hand on the back of his neck, the way I always had since he was 13, and I held it there for a moment. He was taller than me now, had been for about a year, but he leaned into it the same way he always had, and that meant more to me than I would have been able to explain to anyone. I always come back, I said. I went out the back door. The rain hit me immediately, cold and heavy and wind-driven, the kind of rain that soaks through a jacket in 30 seconds and does not apologize for it. I crossed the back porch in 2 strides and went down the steps into the yard. The barn light threw a yellow oval across the mud that ended about 10 feet from the fence gate. Past that was darkness, real darkness, the kind that exists only in the countryside on a cloudy night with no moon. I knew every inch of what lay ahead. I had walked this ground in daylight and in darkness, in summer heat and in ice, through 30 years of seasons. I did not need a flashlight. A flashlight would only tell anyone watching that I was coming. I went through the gate and into the dark pasture and let the farm close behind me. The grass was ankle-deep and soaked, and each step made a sound like something tearing. The eastern fence line was 400 yards ahead of me, 8 minutes at a steady walk less if I pushed. Above the sound of the rain, I could hear the timber in the pines along the south fence moving in the wind, a low, continuous roar that covered the sound of my footsteps and everything else. That cut both ways. It covered me. It also covered whatever was happening ahead. I walked steadily into the dark and did not look back at the house. What I did not know while I was crossing the back pasture in the rain was that 40 minutes earlier, a woman named Sandra Reeves had pulled her car to the side of County Road 7 and made the most important phone call of her professional life. I learned all of it afterward from Marsh, sitting in a hospital waiting room with bad coffee and fluorescent lights. But I have replayed it enough times that I can see it clearly now, the way Marsh described it, the way the pieces connected to everything else that was already in motion that night. Sandra Reeves was 38 years old and had worked at First County Bank for 11 years, the last 4 as the branch's senior compliance officer. Compliance officers at federally insured banks occupy a specific and uncomfortable position. Their job is to identify transactions that violate federal banking regulations, structuring deposits to avoid reporting thresholds, unusual wire transfer patterns, accounts that receive funds from multiple shell sources, and to file suspicious activity reports with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is a division of the U.S. Treasury. They are required by law to do this. They are also in smaller communities where the bank's largest clients are also the community's most prominent citizens, frequently pressured not to. Sandra had been filing mental notes on Vance Capital Group for 6 months before she started filing anything on paper. The pattern she identified was not subtle once you knew what to look for. Money came into a series of accounts in amounts just under the $10,000 federal cash reporting threshold, a practice called structuring, which is itself a federal crime regardless of whether the underlying funds are legitimate. From those accounts, funds moved in layered transfers through 3 different shell companies before landing in accounts connected to local businesses, real estate purchases, and she eventually determined personal accounts belonging to 2 county officials, whose names she recognized from the news. She had made 3 photocopies of the relevant account records. 1 copy went into a fireproof lockbox in her apartment. 1 copy went into a sealed envelope addressed to the FBI field office in Birmingham, which she had mailed 6 weeks ago, and which, had she later learned, arrived and been assigned to an existing investigation that already carried a file number she would have recognized if she had known to look for it. The 3rd copy she kept in her car in a manila envelope tucked under the driver's seat because she had decided that if something happened to her before anyone came looking, she wanted there to be a version of the truth that could survive without her. When the attorney representing Vance Capital had come into the branch 3 days ago with a durable power of attorney document purporting to authorize him to conduct transactions on behalf of a client named Walter Hayes, Sandra had recognized the name within 30 seconds. She had pulled Hayes from the compliance flag list she maintained privately, not the official system which could be accessed and cleared by the branch manager, but a personal spreadsheet on her home laptop, and she had found 2 prior attempts to link accounts in his name to Vance Capital transfers, both of which had been quietly removed from the system by someone with administrative access before she could escalate them. She had told the attorney that the transaction could not be processed. She had cited a signature verification requirement that was real, but not in this specific case strictly mandatory. She had used the rule as a delay tactic while she thought about what to do next. The attorney had left angry. The branch manager had called her into his office 20 minutes later and told her in the careful language of a man who understood he was asking her to do something she should not do, that the client was important to the bank and that she should find a way to accommodate the request. She had smiled and said she would look into it and gone back to her desk and called the FBI tip line from her personal cell phone in the parking garage during her lunch break. That call had been routed to Marsh's team within the hour. Marsh had called Sandra back within 2 hours of that, and Sandra had spent 45 minutes on the phone describing everything she had documented over the previous 6 months in enough detail that Marsh had ended the call by asking her to stay exactly where she was and not discuss the matter with anyone until an agent could reach her. Sandra had agreed. She had then driven home, retrieved the lockbox copy of her records, placed it in the manila envelope with the car copy, and driven to County Road 7, where she pulled over in the rain and waited for the FBI vehicle that Marsh had dispatched from the field unit already operating in the county. The agent who met her took the envelope and gave her a receipt and told her she had done the right thing. She had sat in her car for a long time after the agent drove away, with the rain coming down on the windshield and the engine running for the heat. And she had thought about 11 years of work at a bank she had genuinely believed in, and about the branch manager's careful language, and about the attorney who had come in with the power of attorney document and the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no and expected this time to be the same. She had thought about Walter Hayes, whose name she did not know beyond a compliance flag and a property record, and she had wondered whether he was all right. What she could not have known, sitting in her car on County Road 7 in the rain, was that the man whose name was on her compliance flag was at that same moment 4 miles away, walking through a dark pasture in the same rain with a hand-drawn map and a plan to protect his family toward the eastern fence line of his family's land. When Marsh received word from Tommy that I had left the house, she was on the phone with Sandra's contact agent, confirming receipt of the documents. She ended that call and immediately radioed her field team. I learned later that she used 7 words. Move to the eastern boundary, right now. What was happening to Julian at that hour I did not learn until much later. Some of it from the FBI debrief, some of it from Julian himself across a hospital table with bad fluorescent lighting and 2 cups of coffee neither of us touched. He had been picked up 3 hours after he fled Ridgeline Road. Not by the FBI. By 2 men in a gray panel van who had been parked behind the Dollar General on the south end of town, waiting for exactly that contingency. Julian had apparently believed in the hours after he drove away from the farm that morning that fleeing made him safer. He had spent 3 hours driving county roads in a widening spiral, convincing himself that putting distance between himself and the situation was the same thing as putting distance between himself and its consequences. It was not. It never is. Men like Vance do not allow the people who know their business to simply drive away. The 2 men who collected Julian were named Cole and Dutch. Cole was the senior of the 2 40-something ex-military, bearing the kind of flat economy of movement that belongs to men trained to be efficient rather than impressive. Dutch was younger and quieter, and carried himself with the specific stillness of someone who had learned that silence was more threatening than noise. Julian told me later that neither man raised his voice once during the entire time he was with them. They did not need to. They drove Julian to the eastern edge of my property on a dirt access track that ran along the back of the old Greer timber lease. The land Vance's shell company had acquired 18 months ago, the land that shared a fence line with the eastern boundary of my farm. They parked where the track ended at a rusted gate that I had padlocked from my side 12 years ago when the Greer family sold, and I did not know who the new owners would be. Julian had a shovel in his hands before he fully understood how it had gotten there. Cole pointed towards the tree line with 2 fingers, the economical gesture of a man who had done this before, and Julian walked. Dutch stayed 3 paces behind him. The rain was coming down hard by then, the kind of heavy, sustained downpour that turns dirt paths into shallow streams and fills low spots in pastures with 6 inches of standing water in under an hour. Julian told me his shoes were soaked through within 2 minutes of leaving the van. The coordinates they had were precise. Cole navigated from a handheld GPS unit calling adjustments in short, flat phrases left 10 yards stop until they reached a point 80 feet inside my eastern fence line, where the old apple tree stumps still broke the surface of the ground at irregular intervals. My mother had planted those trees in 1961. The blight had taken them in the 90s, and I had cut them down but left the root systems because pulling stumps on that soil was more work than the ground was worth for grazing. Cole pointed at a spot between 2 stumps. Julian dug. The soil was sandy and loose the way it always was on that end of the property, and the rain had softened the top 8 inches to the consistency of wet concrete. Below that, it was firmer. Julian hit the steel box at approximately 14 inches. He felt the shovel blade skate across the lid before he heard the sound. He cleared the remaining soil with his hands, which were shaking badly enough that the work took longer than it should have. The box was approximately the size of a large shoebox fireproof steel construction with a combination lock on the front hasp. It was heavier than it looked. Cole took it from Julian's hands before he had fully straightened up. Dutch produced a bolt cutter again, a smaller one, and removed the hasp in 2 cuts. Cole opened the box, examined the contents with a small flashlight, and closed it again. He did not show Julian what was inside. He did not need to. Julian told me later that he understood in the moment Cole closed that box and straightened up and looked at him with the particular blankness of a man checking off a task that his usefulness had ended. He had understood it intellectually. Before then, somewhere on the drive out, some part of his brain had been running the calculation and arriving at an answer he did not want to look at directly. But understanding something intellectually and understanding it in your body are 2 different things. And it was not until Cole closed the box and Dutch moved 2 steps to Julian's left. Positioning himself, Julian realized to cover the angle Cole's sightline did not reach that the answer stopped being intellectual. Cole looked at Julian with the expression of a man performing a routine task. "You were never going to walk away from this," Cole said. "You understand that, right? Vance needed a name on the paper trail. Yours was the most convenient." Julian's knees went into the mud before he decided to let them. The rain hit the back of his neck and ran down inside his collar, and he put both hands in the wet soil, and he thought about the farm and the kitchen table and the look on my face that morning, when he had walked onto the porch and thrown the mortgage papers down, and he thought about how I had pushed them back across the table without looking away from him, and something in his chest that had been clenched for a very long time began in the worst possible moment to come apart. Julian opened his mouth, and what came out was not an argument or a negotiation or any of the calculated things he had been saying to people for the last 4 years of his life. What came out was one word pulled from somewhere below all of that. "Dad." His hand landed in the mud beside the open hole and touched the edge of something, a corner of yellowed paper sticking out from beneath the steel box where the rain had washed the soil away from it. An envelope. Old. Water-stained at the edges, but sealed the flap held down with the kind of gummed closure that had not been manufactured since the 1990s. On the front, in handwriting, Julian recognized before he consciously processed why were 4 words. To Walter. Keep safe. Before I reveal the shocking truth hidden deep beneath that soil and the single letter that changes everything, drop the word "still here" or type 777 in the comments right now, so I know you're riding with us till the end. And just a quick heads up, elements of the upcoming chapter contain fictional dramatizations and may not be entirely factual. If that's not your thing, feel free to drop off here. Julian told me later that his first thought when his hand touched the envelope was that he was imagining it. His second thought when he turned it over and saw the handwriting clearly was that he was not. He knew that handwriting the way he knew his own face in the mirror, not by analyzing it, but by recognizing it, the way you recognize something that has been part of you since before you had words for what recognition meant. His mother had written in a particular cursive that leaned slightly to the right with the letters connected in long looping chains that made her sentences look like one continuous unbroken thought. She had written his name on birthday cards that way. She had written grocery lists that way, and notes tucked into his school lunchbox, and the inscription in the Bible she had given him when he was confirmed at 14, which he had not opened since her funeral, and which he was fairly certain he had left in a storage unit in Pensacola sometime around the year he stopped keeping track of things he was leaving behind. To Walter. Keep safe. 4 words. Her handwriting. On an envelope that had been sitting in the ground under a steel box full of someone else's crimes on the eastern boundary of his father's land. Julian told me that Cole said something at that point, an instruction to get up or a warning he could not remember the exact words, and that he did not respond to it. He was aware of Cole and Dutch in the way you are aware of weather as a condition of the environment, rather than something requiring his direct attention. His entire attention was on the envelope in his hands. He opened it. The paper inside was folded in thirds, the way his mother always folded letters, not in half. Never in half, because she said folding in half made the crease run through the middle of the words, and she did not like words to be interrupted. Julian's hands were shaking hard enough that unfolding the paper took longer than it should have. The rain had soaked through his jacket and his shirt, and was running down his forearms and dripping off his wrists onto the paper, and he hunched over it to protect it with his body the way you protect something that cannot get wet. The letter was dated. He recognized the date before he read a word of the content. It was 3 weeks before she died. She had known by then what the prognosis was. She had known, and she had sat down somewhere at the kitchen table. He thought she always wrote at the kitchen table, and she had written this. "Walter, I know you'll find somewhere to put this where it won't get lost. You always find a place for the things that matter even when you don't say so out loud. I've been thinking about Julian. I think about him every day, but I've been thinking about him differently lately, the way you think about something when you understand you won't be there to help with it. He is going to lose his way. I know you know that too, even if neither of us has said it. He loses his way the same way his grandfather did, not from badness, but from wanting too much too fast, and not knowing what to do when the wanting outpaces the having. His grandfather found his way back. You know that story better than I do. I need you to not give up on him when it happens. I know that's a large thing to ask. I know there will be moments when it costs you more than seems reasonable. But Walter, he is ours. He was ours before he was anything else, and whatever he becomes in between doesn't change what he was at the beginning. Don't let him go alone when it matters most. That's the only thing I'm asking. You always go alone when it matters most. So does he. That's my fault. Probably I let you both get away with it for too long. I love you. Take care of the farm. Take care of our boy. Julian told me he read it twice. He told me he was not aware of crying until he tasted salt and realized it was not rain on his face. He told me that the third time he tried to read it, he could not make the words stay still, and he folded it back along his mother's careful creases and held it against his chest with both hands. And the sound that came out of him was not something he had planned or decided to make. It was the sound of something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, finally finding the crack it needed. Cole said something sharp. Julian did not hear it. What Julian heard somewhere inside the grief and the rain and the mud and the specific quality of silence that exists in a field at night when the wind drops for a moment was his mother's voice. Not literally. He was clear about that when he told me he was not hearing things. He was not confused. What he heard was the memory of her voice reading her own words, the way she would have read them aloud if she had been sitting across the table from him, with the slight pause she always made before the sentences that mattered most. Don't let him go alone when it matters most. He looked up. Julian's mouth opened. What he intended to say was his father's name. What came out was something older than that, the word that precedes every other word a person ever learns, the first word, the one that means everything before language has enough vocabulary to be specific. "Dad," Julian said. His voice cracked completely on the single syllable, split open like something that had been waiting a long time to break. "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Dad!" Cole's finger moved to the trigger. It came from the tree line to the north, a single percussive crack that cut through the rain and the wind and the sound of Julian's voice, and the muzzle flash was a brief orange smear in the darkness about 30 yards away, and the load of damage tore into the ground 2 feet from Cole's left boot and threw a spray of mud and wet grass across his shin. The field went very still. Then a voice came out of the dark. Steady. Familiar. the voice of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it. "Put it down," the voice said. "Both of you. Right now." I had been in the tree line for 4 minutes before I fired. 4 minutes of standing in the between two pine trunks, with the rain coming straight down through the canopy and soaking through my jacket and running into my boots, watching the three figures in the open ground ahead of me. I had identified Julian by the way he moved the particular hunch of his shoulders that he had carried since he was a teenager, the way he folded inward when he was frightened. I had identified Dutch by the way he kept moving the lateral repositioning of a trained man, covering angles, never staying in one spot long enough to become a fixed target. I had spent 4 minutes watching Dutch move and calculating where he would be when I needed him to be somewhere specific. My father's old equipment held limited supplies. I had loaded it before I left the house. I had fired one as a warning into the ground close enough to Cole's boot to make the point, without requiring him to make a medical appointment. That left 1 round. 1 round and 2 armed men and my son on his knees in the mud reading a letter from his dead mother while a man with a weapon decided what to do about the situation. I stepped out of the tree line. The rain hit me full in the face and I did not flinch from it. I kept the old equipment raised, steady, aimed at Cole. 22 years of investigative work does not prepare a person for this specific moment, but 30 years of hunting does. The stillness, the patience, the particular quality of attention that exists between the decision to act and the decision not to. "Put it down," I said. "Both of you. Right now." Cole turned toward me slowly. He was not panicked. Men like Cole do not panic, they assess. And what Cole was assessing was the distance between us, approximately 30 yards, and the spread pattern of old tool damage at that range, and the probability that a 70-year-old man standing in the rain at night was going to place his shot accurately enough to matter. I watched him run that calculation behind his eyes. His voice was the same flat professional tone it had been since he arrived. "That tells me you don't want to shoot anyone." Dutch had stopped moving. He was standing at my 10 o'clock position, about 15 yards to my left, and his hand was inside his jacket. I did not look directly at him. Looking directly at a secondary threat is how you lose track of the primary one. I kept my eyes on Cole and my peripheral attention on Dutch, and I counted the seconds in my head, the way I had been taught to count them slowly, without rushing, because urgency is the enemy of accuracy. "Dad." Julian's voice came from the ground between us, raw and wrecked, and barely recognizable as the same voice that had told me it was my choice this morning. He was still on his knees in the mud, the letter pressed against his chest with both hands. "Dad, they're going to... I know what they're going to do," I said without taking my eyes off Cole. "Julian, I need you to get up and move to your right, toward the fence line. Do it slowly, and do it now." Julian pushed himself upright. His legs were shaking badly enough that the first attempt didn't fully work. He got halfway up, and his left knee went back into the mud, and he had to try again. The second attempt got him standing. He took 2 steps to the right. Dutch moved. He came out of my peripheral vision fast, cutting the angle toward Julian, and I understood what he was doing. Julian as a shield. Julian as leverage, Julian as the thing that would make me hesitate. I swung the barrel left toward Dutch, and Dutch stopped. 15 yards. Close enough that the spread at this range would not require precision I did not have. Close enough that he knew it. "Don't," I said. Dutch's hand came out of his jacket empty. He held both hands at shoulder height with the particular carefulness of a man who has just decided that this specific moment is not the one he wants to die in. Cole had not moved. He was watching me with the steady attention of someone still running calculations. "You've got 1 shell left," he said. "I'm aware." I said. One shell, two of us. You're 70 years old and you're standing in a field in the rain. He tilted his head slightly. Those are bad numbers. The numbers were bad when I left the house, I said. I came anyway. I kept the barrel level. My arms were not shaking. I was grateful for that. Here is what is going to happen. You are going to set that box on the ground, and both of you are going to walk back through that gate the way you came in. The box stays here. My son stays here. You leave. And if we don't, I let that sit for a moment. I am 70 years old, and I have 2 bad knees, and I am standing in a field in the rain. You are correct about all of that. But I was also a criminal investigator for 22 years, and I have been in worse rooms than this one. And the men I was in those rooms with were considerably more impressive than either of you. Cole looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at Julian, who was standing 8 feet away with his mother's letter against his chest, and tears and rain running down his face together without any distinction between them. Something shifted in Cole's assessment. Not mercy men like Cole do not carry mercy as standard equipment. What shifted was the calculation. The FBI sirens reached us a half-second later, faint at first, then building fast from the north access road, the layered wail of multiple vehicles moving at speed. Cole heard it at the same moment I did. His eyes cut to the north, then back to me, then to the gate behind him. The box, I said. Cole set it on the ground. He straightened up and looked at me one more time with the expression of a man filing something away for later, and then he turned and walked toward the gate. Dutch followed, both hands still visible. They went through the gate and into the dark of the timber lease access road, moving fast, but not running with the professional composure of men who had contingency plans for situations like this one. I kept the barrel up until I could no longer hear their footsteps. Then Julian made a sound, not a word, not a sentence, just a sound. And I heard 2 sharp cracks from the direction of the access road, and something struck my left leg with a force that took everything out from under me, and the ground came up fast. The ground was cold and wet, and I was grateful for the cold because it meant I could still feel things. My left leg folded underneath me at an angle that told me the muscles had stopped working before my brain had processed why. I had been injured on the job before once 31 years ago during a warehouse arrest that went sideways, and I remembered the way pain arrived in stages. The first stage was almost nothing, just a blunt disruption, like the body's way of buying itself a moment to assess the damage before committing to a response. The second stage was what it actually was. The second stage arrived about 4 seconds after I hit the ground. It started at the outside of my left calf and moved inward and upward with the intensity of something that had been waiting behind a door and was now fully through it. I heard myself make a sound that I would not have chosen to make in front of another person, and I pressed my jaw tight and focused on breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth the way the medic had told me after the warehouse 31 years ago. The way that actually worked, if you committed to it completely. Julian reached me before I had finished the second breath. He dropped to his knees in the mud beside me and his hands went to my leg immediately, not hesitantly, with the urgency of someone who did not have time to be squeamish about what they were touching. His fingers found the injury on the outside of my calf and pressed both palms flat against it. And he pressed both palms flat against it and leaned his weight into the pressure. The pain escalated dramatically. I said a word I had not said in front of my son since he was a child. "I know," Julian said. His voice was wrecked and steady at the same time, the way voices get when a person is operating on the far side of their emotional capacity and the body has taken over. "I know, Dad. Keep breathing. Keep breathing." I am breathing, I said through my teeth. Keep doing it. His hands pressed harder, and I worked my right arm out of the jacket sleeve. Julian pulled it free from underneath me with one hand, while keeping the other pressed against the wound, which required a degree of physical coordination that I was not certain I could have managed from his position, and he folded the jacket into a thick pad and replaced his hands with it, pressing down with his forearm, to maintain the pressure while he pulled his own belt free with his free hand. A tourniquet applied above a calf wound is placed just below the knee on the lower third of the leg. Julian got it into position on the first try, threaded the belt through itself, and pulled it tight, with a force that sent a white spike of pain from my knee to my hip and back again. I heard the sound come out of me before I could stop it. "Almost," Julian said. "Almost, Dad. 2 more seconds." He tied it off. The spike subsided to a sustained, deep throb that I could breathe around. I lay on my back in the rain and looked up at the sky, which was entirely cloud. No stars, no moon, just the flat, dark underside of the storm, with the rain falling straight down from it onto my face. The apple tree stumps rose around me at irregular intervals like the markers in an old cemetery, and the eastern fence line was a dark shape against the slightly less dark tree line beyond it. And I thought about my mother planting those trees in 1961 in the same ground where her letter had been sitting in a steel box for the last several years. And I thought that she would have found the whole situation either deeply meaningful or deeply absurd, and that she probably would have been right either way. "Dad." Julian's voice again, closer now. He had moved from my leg to my side, one hand still pressing the jacket against the wound, and the other hand gripping my right arm just above the elbow with a force that was going to leave a bruise. "Talk to me. Say something." "Your mother would have had opinions about this," I said. Julian made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something that was not a laugh at all. "Yeah," he said. "She would have. She always did. She always did." He gripped my arm tighter. "The FBI is coming. I can hear them. 2 minutes, maybe less." He looked down at me, and in the dim light from the approaching vehicles, his face was a configuration of things I had not seen on it since he was very young, stripped of the calculating intelligence and the controlled presentation, and the particular careful blankness he had built over 40 years of wanting things he did not know how to want honestly. What was left underneath was something I recognized. "I read the letter," he said. "I know." "She knew," he said. "She knew I was going to screw everything up, and she asked you not to give up on me anyway." "She knew you better than you knew yourself," I said. "She always did." Julian's jaw worked. The hand on my arm tightened to the edge of painful, and then eased back. "I put a tracking device on your truck," he said. "I forged your will. I called 2 corrupt cops and told them to pull you over." He stopped. The rain came down between the statements. "You are my son," I said. "The math is simple." The FBI lights crested the north pasture fence line, then 4 sets of headlights swinging wide across the wet grass, the vehicles moving fast, and then stopping hard in a loose perimeter around our position. Doors opened. Voices called out in the practiced shorthand of a tactical entry team securing a scene. Someone with a flashlight found us in under 10 seconds and called the others over. Agent Marsh arrived at my side 30 seconds after that. She dropped to one knee in the mud without any apparent concern for her clothing, and checked Julian's tourniquet with 2 fingers, adjusted the tension a quarter turn tighter, and looked at me with an expression that contained several things she was professional enough not to say out loud. "You promised me," she said. I promised you I would not walk into an open field alone, I said. I walked through a pasture. Different thing entirely. Marsh looked at Julian. He saved my life, Julian said. His voice came out rough and certain, the voice of a man making a statement of fact he intended to stand behind. He walked out here alone and he saved my life. Marsh looked back at me. She pressed her lips together once, and then her professionalism reasserted itself completely. Paramedics are 90 seconds out, she said. You are going to the hospital, Mr. Walter. That is not a request, and it is not a discussion. She stood and put her hand briefly on Julian's shoulder. Not gently exactly, but with the firmness of someone acknowledging that he was still upright and that this mattered. You did good with the tourniquet. Julian looked at his hands. They were covered in mud and rain, and he held them in front of himself and looked at them for a long moment. I should have done better, he said. A long time ago. He lowered his hands and looked at me. A long time ago, Dad. The paramedics arrived and the field filled with light and motion and the organized efficiency of people who knew what they were doing, and Julian stayed beside me with his hand on my arm while they worked, and the rain kept coming down on all of it, without any distinction between the mud and the effort and the apple tree stumps. They took me into surgery at 11:47 and brought me out at 1:23 in the morning. I know the times because there was a clock on the wall directly across from the recovery bed, and it was the first thing I focused on when the anesthesia started releasing its hold, that clock, and the particular quality of silence that exists in a hospital at 2 in the morning, which is not true silence but the accumulated sound of a building full of people trying very hard not to make noise. The injury had entered the outer calf, missed the fibula by approximately half an inch, and required surgical removal from the muscle sheath on the inner side. The surgeon told me later that Julian's tourniquet had been applied correctly and had almost certainly prevented blood loss significant enough to complicate the surgery. She said it the way doctors say things they consider medically relevant rather than emotionally significant, and I received it the same way, and we both understood what it actually meant. What I want to tell you about is what happened in the hallway while I was in surgery. I learned it from Marsh and from Julian himself over the following days, but I have thought about it enough that I can place myself there almost as clearly as if I had been present. Julian had been in the surgical waiting area for 47 minutes when Marsh came through the doors from the elevator corridor. He was still in the clothes he had been wearing in the field, mud-caked jeans, a shirt that had dried stiff with a combination of rain and exhaustion and effort. His father's belt still looped through his own belt loops because he had used his own to make the tourniquet, and the paramedics had returned his father's belt to him at the scene. He was sitting in a plastic chair against the wall with his elbows on his knees and his hands hanging between them, staring at the floor with the focused attention of a man who was not seeing the floor at all. Marsh sat down in the chair beside him without preamble. "Surgery is going well," she said. "The bullet missed the bone. He'll need physical therapy, and he'll have a significant scar, but the surgeon expects a full, functional recovery." Julian released a breath that sounded like it had been held since Ridgeline Road. "Okay," he said. His voice was hoarse from the rain and from everything else. "Okay, good." Marsh set a manila folder on the empty chair to her right. She did not open it immediately. She gave him a moment, 20 seconds, 30, and then she said, "Julian, there is something I need to show you. I want to do it now before your father is out of recovery, because I think you should have time to sit with it before you see him." Julian looked at the folder. "What is it?" 3 months ago, during the early stages of our financial investigation into Vance Capital, we identified a secondary document in the legal records connected to your debt structure. Marsh opened the folder and removed a single page, a photocopy, and placed it on top of the closed folder so Julian could see it without having to touch it. This is a last will and testament bearing your father's name and purported signature. It was prepared by a notary service in Decatur 18 months ago. It names you as the sole beneficiary of the property and all assets. She paused. We ran the signature against 14 authenticated samples of your father's handwriting. It does not match on 11 of the 14 comparison points. Our forensic document examiner has classified it as a forgery. Julian looked at the page for a long time without speaking. The signature at the bottom was close. Whoever had prepared it had studied the real thing carefully enough to approximate the general shape and proportion. But Walter Hayes had a particular habit of crossing his lowercase t with a stroke that curved slightly upward at the right end, a small idiosyncrasy, the kind that develops over decades of writing the same letters, the same way, and the signature on the page crossed its T flat, the way a person copies a signature they have observed but never inhabited. I had it made, Julian said. His voice was flat. Not defensive, not deflecting, simply stating a fact with the resignation of a man who has run out of reasons to construct alternative narratives. I had it made about 18 months ago. I told myself it was insurance, that I would only use it if everything else failed. He looked up from the page to Marsh's face. I never used it. We know, Marsh said. It was never filed or submitted anywhere. We found it in the records of a paralegal service connected to Vance's legal operation. She paused. We believe Vance's people were holding it as leverage over you. If you had ever tried to exit the arrangement, they could have filed it and created a legal dispute over the property that would have tied your father up in litigation for years. Julian absorbed that. The information rearranged something in his face, the understanding that even the worst thing he had done had been turned into a tool against him by people who were considerably more practiced at using people than he was. He doesn't know, Julian said. My father. He doesn't know about this. No, Marsh said. He doesn't. Julian looked back down at the forged signature. At the careful approximation of his father's name, written by someone who had studied it long enough to get most of it right, and had still missed the thing that made it real. He thought about his father in a surgical suite 40 feet away, with an injury in his calf that existed because he had walked into a dark field alone. He took a bullet for me tonight, Julian said. The words came out slowly, each one placed with the deliberate care of a person handling something that might break. And he has no idea that I had his signature forged on a document that would have given me everything he owns. He stopped. His hands had started shaking again, not the fear shaking from the field, but something different, the tremor of a person sitting with the full weight of who they have been. What kind of man does that? Marsh did not answer immediately. She was not the kind of person who filled silences with reassurances she did not mean. The kind who still has time to become a different one, she said finally. She closed the folder and stood. The surgeon will be out in approximately 30 minutes. I would suggest you use them. She picked up the folder and looked at him one more time. For what it is worth, Agent, what your father did tonight, going out there alone the way he did, that is not something a man does for someone he has given up on. She walked back toward the elevator corridor. Julian sat in the plastic chair with his father's belt looped through his own belt loops, and his hands shaking between his knees, and he looked at the empty chair where the folder had been. The doors at the end of the hallway opened. A surgeon in scrubs walked through them, pulling her mask down from her face, and Julian stood up so fast the chair scraped back against the wall. The room they put me in after recovery had one window that looked out onto a parking structure, and a wall clock that ran 2 minutes slow, which I noticed immediately because I have always noticed clocks that run slow. My left leg was elevated on two pillows and wrapped from the knee down in white bandaging that had already acquired a faint, rust-colored stain at the calf level, which the night nurse told me was normal and expected, and not a cause for concern. I told her I was not concerned. She looked at me the way nurses look at patients who say they are not concerned, which is with professional skepticism earned through long experience. Julian came through the door at 2:17 in the morning. He stopped just inside the threshold and looked at me in the bed. The elevated leg, the IV line in my right arm, the monitor on my left index finger measuring things I did not particularly want measured, and something moved through his face that he did not try to control or redirect. He was still wearing the field clothes. Nobody had offered him anything else, and he had not asked. The mud on his jeans had dried to a pale clay color, and his shirt had stiffened across the shoulders, and he was holding his father's belt, my belt, in his right hand. Because someone at the scene had given it back to him after the paramedics removed the tourniquet, and he had been carrying it since then, without quite knowing what to do with it. He walked to the chair beside the bed and sat down in it, and put the belt on the edge of the mattress between us. The surgeon said full recovery, he said. His voice had been wrung out completely, and what was left was something quieter and more direct than I had heard from him in years. Physical therapy, maybe 6 months before you're fully weight-bearing without a cane. I already use a cane in bad weather, I said. My knees. I know, so it is not as significant a change as it sounds. Julian looked at the belt on the mattress. He had looped it through itself the way you coil a rope neatly automatically, the way hands do things they have done enough times to do without thinking. He had watched me coil rope the same way when he was small. "Chick, I told Agent Marsh everything," he said. "On the drive to the hospital. Everything I know about Vance's operation, the accounts, the properties, the names of the people I dealt with directly. All of it." He paused. "She said it was a significant contribution to the existing case." "Good," I said. "I'm going to be charged with something," he said. She was honest about that. The forged will, the arrangement with Cray and Sellers, probably some financial counts connected to Vance's money movement. He said it without in the flat, declarative tone of a man reading a list he has had time to compile and accept. "I'm not asking you to fix that. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did, and I'm not going to try to get out from under it." I looked at my son, 40 years old, sitting in a hospital chair at 2 in the morning, in field clothes, stiff with mud, and his father's dried blood telling me he was going to take what was coming to him. It was the most honest thing I had heard him say in longer than I wanted to calculate. "The will," I said. Julian looked up. "Joe Marsh told me about it in the recovery room," I said. That was not entirely true. She had told me a condensed version, and I had filled in the rest from what I already understood about how Julian thought. "The signature." Julian held my gaze without flinching. "I had it made 18 months ago," he said. "I told you on the drive, I told Marsh on the drive. I'm not going to say it differently to you than I said it to her." "I know you won't," I said. "That is not why I brought it up." He waited. "Your mother's handwriting," I said. "You recognized it on the envelope before you knew what was inside." Julian's jaw tightened. "Yes. Before any of the rest of it. You recognized her handwriting and you stopped." "Yes. She knew you would," I said. "She wrote that letter because she knew there would be a moment when something needed to reach you that arguments couldn't reach. She put it where it would find you when you needed it." I shifted slightly against the pillow, and the leg throbbed in response, and I let it. "She was smarter than both of us put together. She always was. Julian's mouth pulled at one corner, not quite a smile, but the specific expression that exists in the space where a smile would be if the surrounding circumstances permitted one. "Yeah," he said. "She really was." We sat with that for a moment, the way two people sit with something true that does not require elaboration. I am not going to tell you that what you did is all right," I said. "It is not all right. Some of it I am going to have to work through over time, and I will not pretend otherwise because you do not need me to pretend, and I am too old to bother." I reached across the mattress and put my hand over his, which was resting on his knee, and I left it there. "But I went into that field tonight because you are my son and I am your father, and that has not changed, and it is not going to change. Those are the only two facts that matter right now." Julian looked down at my hand on his. His throat worked once. He turned his hand over and gripped mine the way he had not gripped my hand since he was 7 years old, and we were crossing a street in Birmingham, and he reached up and took it without asking. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Some things do not require language to be fully communicated between two people who share enough history, and this was one of them. We stayed that way for several minutes, the clock on the wall measuring the slow minutes of 2 in the morning, the monitor beeping its steady, indifferent rhythm, the parking structure outside the window holding its geometry of concrete and yellow light against the dark. Then the door opened quietly, and Tommy came in. He was wearing clean clothes. Someone had found him a sweatshirt and a pair of hospital-issue scrub pants that were 6 inches too long and had been rolled up at the cuffs. And his face was the face of a boy who had been awake for 20 hours, holding more than a 17-year-old should have to hold, and was still somehow standing. He stopped inside the door and looked at the two of us, at my hand over Julian's, at Julian still in his field clothes, at the belt coiled on the edge of the mattress. He took all of it in without comment. Then he crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed on my right side, carefully avoiding the leg, and leaned his shoulder against mine, the way he had leaned into my hand on his neck for 4 years. "May is in the waiting room," he said. "She brought cornbread." Julian looked at him. Something in his face that had been clenched since the morning shifted and did not go back. "Of course she did," Julian said. "She said she figured someone would need it." Tommy looked at Julian for a moment, the same steady, assessing look he had given everything tonight. "She also said to tell you that she took photographs of both police cruisers and their license plates and emailed them to her nephew in Birmingham in case it was useful." Julian stared at him. "It's already in the file," I said. "Of course it is," Julian said. He looked at Tommy for another moment, and then he said quietly, "I don't know your name. I mean, I know your name, but I don't know you." Tommy looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. "We've got time." I woke at 5:43 to the sound of rain still coming down outside the window. The storm had not broken overnight. It had settled into the kind of steady, patient downpour that the Gulf Coast sends inland several times each autumn, not dramatic anymore. Not the wind-driven sheets of the previous night, but the quiet, persistent rain that soaks into everything slowly and stays. The parking structure outside my window was dark and wet, and the yellow lights reflected off the standing water on the concrete in long, wavering lines. Tommy was asleep in the recliner in the corner, folded into it sideways, with his knees pulled up and his head at an angle that was going to leave his neck stiff for 2 days. Julian was in the second chair upright. Not asleep, I could tell by his breathing, staring at the window with his hands flat on his thighs. Neither of them had left the room. I lay still and listened to the rain and the monitor and the distant sounds of a hospital waking up the cartwheels in the corridor. The low voices of the shift changed somewhere down the hall, a phone ringing 3 times and stopping. The leg hurt in the dull, sustained way of something that has moved past the acute stage into the long stage, which is worse in some ways, because it is harder to breathe around and easier to make larger in your mind than it actually is. The knock on the door came at 6:12. It was quiet. 2 knocks spaced deliberately, the knock of someone who was aware that people might be sleeping and was trying to respect that while still making himself known. I knew that knock. I had known it for 45 years across 100 different doors in a dozen different buildings. "Come in," I said. Frank Briggs came through the door. He was wearing the clothes he had been taken in: dark slacks, a flannel shirt with the collar button missing one shoe that had lost its lace at some point and been retied with what appeared to be a piece of twine. His face carried 36 hours of exhaustion and the particular gray pallor of a man who had not eaten since before he was picked up, and his left wrist had the same kind of marks. Mine had the redness of restraints worn too long in the wrong direction. But his eyes were Frank's eyes, clear and steady, and containing the specific quality of attention that had made him an exceptional law enforcement officer for 3 decades and had never entirely left him in the years since. He looked at me in the bed. He looked at Julian in the chair. He looked at Tommy asleep in the recliner. Then he looked back at me. 9mm. Left calf. Missed the bone. I paused. "You look terrible. I've looked worse." He came into the room and pulled the small rolling stool from the corner and sat down on it beside the bed, which put him at approximately the height of a man sitting across a desk. "Our old configuration. 45 years of it. They let me out 2 hours ago. Marsh's team found the location around midnight. I've been at the field office since then giving a statement." He looked at his hands briefly. "They fed me a sandwich from a vending machine. Egg salad. I don't recommend it." "No," I said. "How's the leg?" "It will do what it's supposed to do eventually." The surgeon seemed confident. Frank nodded slowly. He glanced at Julian, who had turned from the window and was watching him with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. Frank held his gaze for a moment without hostility and without warmth, just acknowledgement, the look of a man taking a full inventory before deciding what to do with it. "Julian," he said. Frank." Julian's voice came out rough. "I owe you an apology that I don't have adequate words for." "You owe me $214,000, Frank said. There was no particular edge in it. He said it the way a man states an arithmetic fact. "The apology can wait. The money I'm probably not going to see again, so we should both make our peace with that." Julian looked like he had been hit with something he had not seen coming, which was the appropriate response to Frank. Frank had always communicated that way directly, without the cushioning that most people wrapped around difficult truths, because he had decided somewhere in his 30s that cushioning difficult truths did not make them less true, and only delayed the part where everyone had to deal with them. "I didn't know you were doing it," Julian said. "I knew someone was covering the payments for a while, but I didn't know it was you." Frank looked at him steadily. "Would it have changed anything if you had—" Julian opened his mouth and then closed it again. The honest answer was the kind that required sitting with for a moment before delivering, and Frank gave him the moment. "Probably not," Julian said finally. "And I'm ashamed of that." Frank turned back to me. Something in his expression had completed itself. He had taken the inventory and reached a conclusion and filed it away in the particular manner of a man who has decided that what is done, and what remains is what remains. "I went across my own pasture," I said. "Different thing." "You got shot." The geometry was unfavorable at the end. Frank looked at me for a long moment. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, the same configuration Julian's face had found in the night, the expression that lives in the vicinity of a smile, without committing to one. "Walter Hayes," he said. 70 years old, 2 bad knees, 1 functioning calf, and you still cannot let anyone else handle the field work. You would have done the same thing. I would have, he agreed, which is why I'm allowed to comment on it. He reached over and put his hand on my forearm and left it there. Frank's version of the gesture, the one that covered everything that did not need to be said aloud, because saying it aloud would only diminish it. "I'm glad you're here." "I know, Wint," I said. Tommy stirred in the recliner. He uncurled himself and sat up and looked around the room with the disoriented urgency of someone whose body woke up faster than his brain, and then his eyes found me in the bed, and the urgency settled. "Frank's here," I said. Tommy looked at the older man on the rolling stool. Frank looked back at him with the same steady inventory he had given Julian. "This is the boy who called May," Frank said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. Frank looked at Tommy for a long moment. "Good instincts," he said. "Your grandfather teach you that?" Tommy glanced at me, then back at Frank. "Some of it," he said. "Some of it I figured out." Frank nodded, once the nod of a man who considers self-sufficiency a significant virtue and is acknowledging it in someone else. He turned back to the window where the rain was still coming down in the gray early morning light, and he sat with his hand on my forearm and said nothing for a while, because there are configurations of people in rooms that have said everything that needed to be said and are simply waiting for the next thing to begin. The door opened. Agent Marsh came in carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. She looked at Frank on the rolling stool and me in the bed, and Julian in the chair and Tommy in the recliner and the general arrangement of the room, and she set 1 cup on the bedside table beside me and kept the other. "Gentlemen," she said, "when you're ready." She looked at me directly. We found Vance. Marsh pulled a chair to the bed, and we spent 90 minutes doing the kind of work that looks nothing like what people imagine federal investigations look like. No dramatic revelations. Just a legal pad, a pen, and a recording device the size of a deck of cards on the bedside table. I told her everything in the order it happened: the mortgage documents, the GPS tracker, the video of Frank, the environmental complaint, Tommy's hand-drawn map, the walk across the pasture, the 4 minutes in the tree-lined Cole and Dutch, and the steel box, and the letter, and the 2 shots from the access road. She asked precise, short questions at the end of each section. She had done this a long time. It showed. When I finished, she produced a 2-page voluntary witness statement and placed it on the tray table. I read every word. It was accurate. I signed it and noticed my hand was as steady as it had been in the field. She confirmed that Sandra Reeves's financial documentation, the hard drive from the steel box, Julian's cooperation statement, and Deputy Ray Hollins's body camera footage together constituted a comprehensive evidentiary package. Ray had recorded the entire Ridgeline road stop from the moment the cruisers deployed. "He did the right thing," I said. "He did," Marsh agreed. Julian asked about the farm. Marsh told him the environmental hold would lift by afternoon, and the property was unencumbered, Walter Hayes uncontested. What we did with it was our business. I looked at the window. The rain was easing. "Tommy," I said, "where would you want to go?" He considered it seriously. "Somewhere with water, the ocean, somewhere you can hear it from the porch." I looked at Julian. "You heard the boy." Julian looked at the window, and something in his face finally released the careful blankness giving way to something that looked like a man standing in his own light. "I don't have anywhere else to be," he said quietly. "If that counts." "It counts," I said. Frank looked at the ceiling when Tommy asked Julian if he knew how to drive a bus. Julian's truck was impounded. Frank said the bus station was south on Route 11 left on Caldwell. Julian stood up in his mud-caked clothes and straightened his shoulders. "Okay," he said. "Let's go find the bus station." The bus left Beaumont County at 11:40 in the morning. I had a window seat, because Julian insisted the way he maneuvered Tommy into the aisle and took the middle himself without making a production of it. Just arranged it quietly the way you do things for people when you have decided that doing things for them is the point. My left leg stretched into the aisle elevated on the duffel bag Tommy had wedged underneath it, with the focused attention of a boy who had spent 4 years learning the geometry of an old man's limitations. May kissed my forehead at the station. Frank shook Julian's hand, and Julian took it with both of his, which I had never once seen him do with another man. Frank nodded once and said nothing. That was everything. Then the bus came and we got on it. I watched Beaumont County disappear through the window. The water tower, the grain elevator, the Methodist steeple where Ellen and I had been married 43 years ago. The rain had stopped completely. The sky had gone that particular pale blue that only follows a Gulf storm washed clean and new. I watched until there was nothing left to watch. Then I closed my eyes and slept for the first time in 36 hours. We found Crane's Bluff on the Florida Panhandle 40 miles east of Pensacola. Small enough that nobody needed to explain themselves. Large enough that nobody needed to know your business. I found a wood frame house 3 blocks from the water with a porch that caught the afternoon Gulf breeze and a kitchen large enough for 3 people without negotiating for space. The landlord was a retired shrimper named Dooley, who had no interest in conversation before 9 in the morning, which suited me exactly. Julian found work at a marine repair shop within 2 weeks. The owner Garrett told him on the 3rd day that he worked clean and thought before he cut. Julian came home that evening and said he thought he might stay. He stayed. Tommy enrolled in community college marine biology and rode a $40 bicycle to class every morning like a man who had always known exactly where he was going. I sat on the porch. 3 years of it. Coffee going cold. Gulf wind. Julian bringing me a cup some mornings without being asked, without ceremony, without needing anything back. In the 2nd year, Marsh called to tell me the indictments had come through Vance Cole Dutch and 11 others. Sandra Reeves accepted a position with the Treasury Department. Deputy Ray Hollins enrolled in law school at the University of Alabama. In the 3rd year, a letter arrived, confirming the farm was mine again, unencumbered. Julian found it on the kitchen table that evening. He came out to the porch and stood beside my chair. "You want to go back?" he asked. I thought about a pasture in the rain, a letter in a yellow envelope, 4 minutes in a tree line deciding what kind of man I intended to be. "No," I said. He went inside. I heard him call Tommy about dinner. The Gulf was loud that night, something that had existed long before any of us and intended to outlast us all. I stayed on the porch until I was ready. Then I went inside. I have told you this grandpa story honestly, not to make myself look like a good man, but because I was not always one, and I think that matters more. Here is what I believe. God does not waste the hard things. Not the bullet. Not the rain. Not the letter Ellen left in the ground where the apple trees used to be. Every piece of it became something we needed. But I want to say this directly. As a man who learned it the wrong way, do not wait. Do not look away from your child's slow unraveling because watching it hurts. I looked away for years. I told myself it was patience. It was not patience. It was avoidance, and avoidance has a price that other people end up paying. My personal view after 70 years and one bullet wound forgiveness is not a feeling you wait for. It is a decision you make before you are ready, and you make it because the alternative costs more than you are willing to spend. That is what this family story taught me. That is what I carry from that pasture in the rain. If this family story reached something in you tonight, leave a comment and tell me what it was. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if grandpa stories like this one matter to you, subscribe, because there are more coming and some of them will surprise you. Thank you for staying with this family story all the way to the end. It means something real. One honest note before you go: some stories on this channel include fictional elements built for the purpose of illustration and reflection. If that is not for you, we understand completely, and we hope you find exactly the content that serves you best. For everyone else, we will see you next time.